So today I'm so excited to introduce our first speaker, Shane Gunster. Shane is an associate professor in the School of Communications at SFU, Simon Fraser University, and a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. His work focuses on news and advocacy communications about the politics of energy and climate in Canada. And his latest co-authored book is Journalism and Climate Crisis, Public Engagement, Media, Alternatives. And that's with Routledge from 2017. So this is really, that book, really the tip of the iceberg in terms of Shane's scholarship. But what I think is most remarkable about Shane is his, and remarkable and commendable, is that he is a truly engaged scholar. So we're really happy to have him today, and we're looking forward to his thoughts on what is happening with the virus, what's the pandemic doing to our sensibilities, and what are the possibilities of this moment. So over to you, Shane. I think you've got some slides you're going to share with us.
Yeah, I do. Great. Thanks very much, Joanna, for that introduction. And yeah, I think I'm probably going to end up talking actually a little bit more about COVID than climate, or at least about the connections between them, because I know that's certainly on my mind. But then obviously happy to think about the climate connections in the Q&A. Mm-hmm. So yes, I do have some slides that I'm going to share. So I'm going to try and start that and make sure that works. Can everybody see the slides? Yes? Okay, great. Good. Okay. So I wanted to start then by thanking Joanna and Cam, and it sounds like a big team of others for putting together the series and for inviting me to chat with you today. I'm going to try and keep my comments to around 20 minutes, so there's lots of time for discussion. And honestly, there are so many smart people who have been saying so many smart things about the connections between COVID and climate that I don't know if I really have anything new to add to the mix. So much of what you're going to hear from me today, you may have heard elsewhere, shall we say, borrowed from others. So one of my favorite thinkers, just want to make sure the slides advance, there we go. One of my favorite thinkers on the topic of crisis and disaster is the American essayist and author Rebecca Solnit. So here's a quote from an op-ed that she published a few weeks ago. Every disaster, and you might have to change the visuals in terms of if you have little boxes of video on your screen to see the quote. But anyways, every disaster, she writes, shakes loose the old order. The sudden catastrophe changes the rules and demands new and different responses, but what those will be are the subject of a battle. These disruptions shift people's sense of who they and their society are, what matters, and what's possible, and lead often to a deeper and more lasting change. The literal meaning of apocalypse from the original Greek word is the uncovering of what was hidden, the uncovering of what was hidden. And the pandemic, I think, has definitely served as a moment of revelation, a bringing to light of things that are all too often hidden away, covered up, repressed in both our politics, but also in our everyday lives. And two aspects of this revelation are, I think, especially worth highlighting. The first is that our collective health and well-being depends a great deal upon the labor, the work of a bunch of people who are otherwise ignored, devalued, and exploited in an economy that is organized to serve the interests of profit. Now, this is not, I think, a particularly surprising revelation, but rather it's a kind of common knowledge, if you will, that many of us had come to accept as an inescapable feature of life under the rule of capital. To accept and then to forget, to wall away, to keep at a distance. To deny, in much the same way that sociologist Kari Norgaard and Greta Thunberg, for that matter, argue that so many of us continue to live in a kind of denial about the climate crisis. And I think it may be worth reflecting upon if and how a dramatic and pervasive alarmism in communication about the virus played some part in forcing broad social recognition of a truth that had previously been hidden in plain sight. So alarmism, as it turns out, may have some productive role to play in climate communication after all. COVID has not only thrust the reality of essential labor into the spotlight, but it's also compelled, I think, a reckoning with how low wages, minimal job security, and dangerous working conditions make our societies as a whole weaker, more fragile, and vulnerable to all kinds of disruption. And this, I think, has reminded us of the very simple argument that Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson made with such force in their 2009 book, The Spirit Level: Why Equality is Better for Everyone. The transformation of our society, they wrote in that book, is a project in which we all have a shared interest. Greater equality is the gateway to a society capable of improving the quality of life for all of us. Or as the Guardian review put it very simply, we do better when we're equal. A kind of primary elementary wisdom confirmed by even the most cursory review of how different countries with competing approaches and priorities have fared in coping with the pandemic. Some people have noted how the extraordinary behavioral changes called forth by the pandemic are a kind of testament to our individual capacity to remake our lives in response to a crisis. Personally, I think we actually should be cautious, somewhat cautious about that line of argument. Relatively modest declines in emissions speak to the limits of an emphasis upon lifestyle change. And as you may have seen, opponents of climate action have gleefully and provocatively seized upon the isolation and deprivation of the pandemic as delivering a kind of sneak peek at life under a Green New Deal. What I do take from the pandemic, though, is the critical importance of fairness and equality in generating the solidarity, the empathy, and the common cause that license the mobilization, that free up, if you will, the mobilization of enormous social resources to respond to crisis. When we believe that the same rules apply to everyone, our tolerance, our capacity, our appetite for collective action, including no small measure of sacrifice, is truly remarkable. Equality really is the gateway to a better society, a principle that is just as important to communication as it is to policymaking, and one I think that advocates for environmental and climate justice have long recognized and understood. And the second revelation, also one that we have known from the corporate bailouts during the 2008 financial crisis, but more instructively perhaps from the enormous mobilization of our society's resources to fight fascism in the Second World War, and something that's often not said in the same sentence, to rebuild afterwards. We have the money. We have the money. We've always had the money. We have an enormous capacity to marshal the resources of society to tackle the biggest of problems if and when our governments decide to do so. The billions, trillions of dollars that governments of all political stripes have poured into supporting individuals and businesses through the pandemic has, at the very least, I think, shifted the so-called Overton window when it comes to thinking about our capacity to finance recovery and transition. I do worry, though, I fear that this insight, this truth, may turn out to be fragile and vulnerable to a rhetoric of austerity that is going to come roaring back in the days and months to come. And I don't think we can take this insight for granted. Instead, I think figuring out creative and coordinated ways of deepening the frame of public fiscal capacity is really going to be critical in the months ahead. A couple of weeks ago, Ecos Research published a poll in which they surveyed Canadians about various aspects of the crisis, which I think really nicely illustrates how some of this is playing out with the public at large, which we don't always have a good sense of when we're in our social media bubbles, so to speak. What problems have been revealed by the pandemic? Well, at the top of the list, unsurprisingly, is the shockingly low regard we place on the lives of elderly and disabled Canadians, due in no small measure to a privatized system that puts profit ahead of people, including those who work in that system. Social class inequality. 8 in 10 Canadians see this also as a significant problem revealed by the pandemic. And this is clearly borne out by evidence about the much greater risk of infection to low-income and minority and racialized communities. Class matters. Again, a truth that we've kind of known for a long time. Class matters, as does its intersection with race and gender. But this mattering has become visible. It's become an object of shared concern in ways that it just simply hasn't in a long time in this country. When the crisis is over, do you expect a return to the status quo or a broad transformation of our society? Almost 3/4 expect a broad transformation. There is a strong and widely shared appetite for change, a feeling that we can and should begin to address those deeper problems that we've accepted for too long, cynically, I think, for the most part, as beyond our capacity to address. Here's a slide from another recent poll. This one came out over the weekend from Abacus. What aspects of Canada's social safety net need improvement? And you can see from this slide, strong majorities in favor of significant improvement in all of these areas: healthcare, paid sick days and livable wages, income support, and employment insurance. And last slide in terms of the polling results, this one also from Abacus. What principles and areas should be prioritized in the recovery? And I don't obviously have time to spend a lot of time reading through that slide, but you can see the areas that are emphasized there and the support for changes in them: food security, pharmacare, a wealth tax, challenging corporate power, tackling inequality, high levels of support, in other words, for progressive social and economic policies, and beyond that, for a transformative political agenda. So what are some of the opportunities, but also challenges then that we face at this moment, at this crossroads, in terms of communicating and engaging with people about things like the climate crisis? So I want to make 3 points in that regard. And again, they're all probably pretty obvious. Certainly that thought occurred to me as I was looking at this last night, but worth emphasizing nonetheless. First point: the idea and the appeal of government action to address problems has received a massive shot in the arm. And yes, the vaccine analogy is a deliberate one. So this, for me, was one of the most interesting findings of the ECOS poll. I was really quite blown away by this particular finding. And when Frank Graves was first posting about this, he said that he had never before seen such high direction of government numbers. And he's been tracking this for over 30 years. And this in the midst of the most severe economic crisis since the Great Depression, and what will probably turn out to be the biggest deficit since the Second World War. Recall the core message of neoliberalism that's been hammered home, driven at us over the past 4 decades. Government is inefficient. Government is corrupt. Government is the enemy. Government is the problem, never the solution. In that context, this turnaround is remarkable. Reinforcing and expanding this basic conceptual frame, government as a problem solver, is critical and will be critical. Trust in government, and by this, I don't mean trust in this party or that politician, but trust in the efficacy of a democratic government that is responsive to the will and the needs of citizens and communities, that allows us to do things together that we can't do by ourselves. That is the building block of progressive politics. It's the precondition for things like the Green New Deal or the call for a just recovery, an initiative that was launched on Monday, I think, by a whole bunch of different groups. And while the crisis has, for the moment, shattered a neoliberal anti-government narrative that really had itself grown kind of brittle over the past decade since the financial crisis, again, I don't think we can take that shift for granted. Instead, and this is connected to the comments that I made about the public fiscal capacity frame, I think we really need to think about and build this argument into a kind of common sense, a political common sense that both enables and constrains how we think and talk and feel about politics in this country. and stories about how governments all around the world are moving forward with a just recovery, experimenting with bold action, actually getting good things done, is one of the best ways of doing that. And Cam might have a little bit more to say about that in his comments, and probably in the Q&A in terms of his work on solutions journalism. It's also, I think, worth noting that trust in government is not on the rise everywhere. And truth be told, this pessimistic outlook is hard to argue with in the United States, given the truly abysmal response of that government to the pandemic, as well as a bailout that has flowed primarily to the rich and powerful. But this, I think, is also why here in Canada, we need to be cautious about totalizing cynical language that dismisses governments as nothing but corrupt institutions that serve the interest of corporate power. Both the perception and, I think, to be fair, the reality that our own government's response has been more effective and, to a certain extent, more equitable than in some other places is a big part of why I think we have this window of opportunity. And if that's partly a myth, and I think it is, it's a productive fiction that can be mobilized to our advantage. Second point, contesting national identity. In much the same way that COVID invites us to reimagine the state, to imagine a different kind of state, I think the crisis creates a similar opportunity around the nation. So as Joanna briefly mentioned at the start, much of my own research over the past few years has focused upon the politics of energy in Canada. And that has left me deeply concerned about how aggressively and effectively supporters of the fossil fuel industry have cultivated a petro-nationalism that positions the oil and gas sector as essential to the prosperity, the well-being, and even the identity of the country. For a whole bunch of good reasons, progressive groups have been generally pretty reluctant to join the battle over national identity, worried clearly that any and all forms of nationalism contribute to a toxic mix of xenophobia, racism, scapegoating, colonialism, and so on. I'm sympathetic to that reasoning, deeply sympathetic to that reasoning, but I also think tactically it's been a mistake. If progressives don't fight for what we think Canada should stand for, then I think it becomes far too easy for conservatives to harness the positive feelings that so many Canadians do have for their country or about their country to the worst bits of nationalism. And so just as COVID has supercharged the legitimacy of the state, so too has it elevated questions of national identity to the top of the political agenda. There are, for example, lots of Canadians who feel some measure of pride in how this country's response has differed from the United States in some noteworthy ways. And I think this gives us an opportunity to break decisively with petronationalism and build new narratives around Canada anchored in a very different set of values and priorities for this country. What values are those? These ones that underlie these political priorities: democracy, equality, fairness, compassion, and sustainability. In 2016, pollster Nick Nanos posed a simple, open-ended question in one of his surveys. What makes you proud to be a Canadian? The top response, given by just over a quarter of the respondents in that particular poll: equality, equity, and social justice. Other popular answers included our reputation as peacekeepers, multiculturalism and diversity, respect for others, education, healthcare. We can't keep letting CAP, Canadian Association for Petroleum Producers, Jason Kenney, Don Cherry, although I guess we don't have to worry about him anymore, we can't keep letting them monopolize and define the meaning of Canada and Canadian values. Which brings me to my third, and thankfully for you, final point, the positive and clarifying role that I think political conflict can and should play in this particular moment. Now, narratives of conflict almost always feature as the bad guy in talks about climate communication. Polarization, division, tribalism, these are cast as problems that constructive, solutions-oriented forms of communication need to overcome. And in many cases, I think that's absolutely true. Formulaic accounts of politics that stage it as a fight between entrenched special interests or professionalized stakeholders can really turn people off politics. They deepen our cynicism, our alienation. They leave us skeptical that there is any point in getting politically engaged. But in other cases, conflict narratives play an essential role in clarifying and amplifying the differences between contrasting worldviews, between a conservative or neoliberal perspective that seeks a return to business as usual as fast as possible, and a progressive one that demands a social and political transformation anchored in principles of social justice. When you come to a crossroads, you have to make a choice. You have to make a choice. Keeping that sense of political choice front and center is, I think, a critical part of translating broad, but often somewhat amorphous desires for a better society, for a better Canada, into concrete policies and actions. And this might be a heretical thing to say in this kind of a venue, but I think we should be especially attentive to those political issues that amplify and showcase the differences in values and priorities between different worldviews. So here are two of my favorites at the moment. A wealth tax, a terrific idea that only seems to get more and more popular over time. And if you're an environmentalist that's sick of advocating for taxes that aren't popular, well, have I got a tax for you? The wealth tax. And what's the province that has the highest rate of support for this idea? Right here in British Columbia, 90% support. I wonder if that has anything to do with the off-the-chart levels of inequality fueled by an insane real estate market here on the Lower Mainland. And my personal favorite of the moment, this one. This is a slide from, those are both slides from the Abacus poll. If you get assistance from government, you can't use tax havens, pay excessive executive salaries, use it for share buybacks, or pass it on to investors. A great intervention that also, I think, makes the broader point that tax havens, executive salaries, and profiteering are not etched in stone as laws of nature, or economics for that matter, but things that are subject to collective political intervention, things that we, through our governments, can change. Because ultimately, we shouldn't kid ourselves into thinking that we'll get any of these policies because they're well designed or the right thing to do, or are even favored by a majority of Canadians. As this recent op-ed by our former Prime Minister in the Wall Street Journal suggests, they're going to be opposed, and vigorously, by powerful interests that are committed to getting back to the bad old way of doing things as quickly as possible. In short, getting all that good stuff that we're finally talking about, healthcare, working conditions, more equality, social justice, Green New Deal, it's not going to come without a fight. And filling in the details of that conflict, who is on what side, why it matters, and how to be a part of it rather than just watching from the sidelines. Those are going to be critical issues as we move into the recovery. So just to quickly wrap up in a minute, I know I'm a little bit over time, sorry about that. Writing about environmental communication, Susan Seneca, she's a public engagement prof from New York. She once said, you know, the crisis is not that environmental situations have become more dire, although they certainly have. The crisis is that people have become increasingly cynical about all levels of civic life to address them. The pandemic has opened a door to challenge that crisis of efficacy, of cynicism, of feeling like the story of the future has already been written. But thinking about how to nurture that impulse is, I think, harder and more challenging than it looks. It's going to need more than just blasting out proposals for policy reform, which are wonderful. And I'm so thankful for the amazing work that so many people and organizations are doing in that area. But I also think we have to be attentive to this rewriting of the imagination that Kim Stanley Robinson invoked in this piece. How do we make it easier and more meaningful for people, both individually and collectively, to write themselves into stories of change? I don't have any easy answers to that question, but I certainly look forward to hearing your ideas in the in the Q&A. So I am going to leave it there, and I will stop sharing my slides. Thanks for your time.
Shane, thank you so much. There's a lot in there to talk about, but the things that stand out, this idea of catastrophe, uncovering what was already there, that is a very powerful message. And also just looking at the polls and what Canadians are saying, what they're thinking, where their values are at, and it does really seem to point to an opportunity. And this idea of writing ourselves into this new, what comes next, I think is a very compelling one, and something that as climate communicators, and many of you are working in that area, are paying attention to. Is like, how do we do that? And I think there's so much to talk about from what you've raised, but thank you so much for such a thoughtful and well prepared presentation. And to build on that, I'm really happy to introduce Kamyar Razavi. Cam is he's a PhD candidate in the School of Communications. He's a television news producer with a major Canadian news outlet. And his doctoral dissertation examines the role of solutions-oriented journalism in engaging audiences on climate change. So we're really thrilled to have him talk about what this all means for communicators. Cam's also part of our planning team for this series. And I have to say, I'm just going to do a little bit of praise for Cam, but it's wonderful to work with him because he's both a practitioner and a scholar. So I also want to draw your attention to a recent article that he wrote for the National Observer. I think we'll put it up on the chat. That's captured a lot of attention around this idea of the intersection of the pandemic and climate communication. So over to you, Cam. Looking forward to your remarks.
Thanks very much, Joanna. Can I just get a thumbs up from those of you on camera that my audio is clear? A little thumbs up. Okay, great. Great, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for attending my talk. Yeah, my name is Cam Razavi. I'm a PhD candidate, as well as a news producer, as Joanna mentioned, for a major Canadian broadcast and digital news company. I'm going to talk for about 10 to 12 minutes, very short. I don't have any slides, and I did that on purpose because I want to make this more intimate, more of a conversation. Think of it more as a podcast rather than a presentation. I really want to leave time at the end after the breakouts for Q&A, because usually whenever I do these talks, I get a lot of questions. I'm sure you have questions for Shane too. So I want to leave time for that. So feel free to take notes. I will share the resources and the sources for my talk at the end in the chat. And if you have any additional questions that aren't answered, you can message me privately on Zoom, and I will send you information, resources, and whatever other interesting things. So I want to build on what Shane discussed and focus this talk on why we have no trouble taking action on the coronavirus, but then find it so consistently difficult to engage and mobilize audiences when it comes to climate change. So the first important thing to know about how we engage with risks is what is known in psychology as the value-action gap, also known as the attitude-behavior gap. So this is the gap that exists between our values and the actions that we take. So if you ask people on the street, do you care about the environment? The answer normally would be yes, but actions are still fleeting. So why? Why is that? Well, the answer is that people do not always act in accordance with the values that they have, with what they know, feel, or think. And that is the value-action gap. In other words, our behaviors are not always shaped by conscious deliberation. This is why it's so difficult to break habits, particularly around things like transportation choices. Usually, the time to intervene is short when there's an opening for making that intervention, like when you move to a new subdivision right next to the SkyTrain or the subway. So COVID-19 is that intervention right now. It's shaken up many of our norms and standards. So if you are a city that wants to shift people away out of their cars and onto cycling, the window to act is now, and the window to act is short. So what determines how big that gap between our values and our actions is? Well, there's two things. The first are the attitudes that we have with respect to a given issue. So attitudes are shaped most strongly by our direct experience. The way we have experienced the world shapes our thinking. So think about people who have influenced you, from friends to family to teachers. Those relationships shape our worldviews and make us who we are. And it explains why some really smart and educated people don't see the risks that the science is telling them about climate change, often because they're surrounded by people who think that way too. And then the second thing that moderates the value-action gap are situational constraints, namely social and political norms, basically the way we see the world operating. So if you live in a city that has a very strong car culture, that's a situational constraint that makes it very difficult to shift your mindset away from the car as the dominant form of transportation. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the communication around risk has simply built on the standard that people make rational decisions based on how much information they have. So if you just give people more information about the science of global warming, they will take action, or so the theory goes. But this approach does very little to shrink that value-action gap. That gap is big for a lot of people when it comes to climate, but it's not big when it comes to coronavirus. Protecting our health is a priority, which aligns with our values, and acting on it seems obvious. But it's not so obvious with climate. So why? So this brings me to a discussion of the various barriers for engagement on climate change. There are two types of barriers, individual and social. So let me start with some of the individual barriers. I think we can all agree that the coronavirus crisis feels like a real, immediate, and personal threat to our health and safety. But for most people, climate does not benefit from that same sense of personal immediacy. So what are some of the other individual barriers that impede action on climate change? Well, taking action on climate, unlike taking action on the coronavirus, brings very little immediate gratification. I can stop driving my car tomorrow, but I won't see the impacts of that on the planet tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that. I probably won't ever see those benefits in my lifetime. But if I wear a face mask, I feel like I'm benefiting immediately. And then there are social barriers. The biggest one, as Shane described, is the overarching cynicism with respect to politics and politicians. This idea that government is perpetually broken, that politicians are hopelessly at odds with one another, that political action on climate can never happen. This cynicism and hyper-partisanship are exacerbated and fueled by narratives in the news media that pit one side against the other, that present politics as a battleground for scandal and corruption, and that turn election coverage into a nonstop soap opera. So you might say that the answer to this spiral of cynicism, and that's the title of a really good book, by the way. You might say that the answer to this spiral of cynicism is to just put a positive spin on things, to talk more about solutions, to move the conversation around climate away from the focus on doom and gloom. And as you all know, so much of the communication, including so much of the news coverage around climate change, is focused on that fear. You know, the ice caps will melt, the polar bears will die, the seas will rise. But what is the role of fear in communicating risk, including from climate change? Well, one of the prevailing attitudes in climate communication is that excessive fear messaging shuts people down, leads to hopelessness and resignation. It's a very compelling idea, but unfortunately, it's not backed by the evidence. If that was true, people would watch happy news all the time, which they don't. and which rightly does not qualify as news. So there is a role for fear, but are we using fear messaging in a way that is optimal and productive? I would argue no, otherwise people would care more about the polar bears. What the research shows us is that fear messaging, also known as fear appeals, that focus just on the threat, but that don't contain information as to what can be done about that threat, shut people down, lead to issue avoidance, even denial. It's called fear control. This is one reason why climate change can be such a conversation killer. We are hardwired by evolution to run away from threats we can't control. But, and this is the important point, fear messages that are coupled with information about how one can take action to deal with the threat, efficacy, motivate people to take action to actually reduce the threat, what's known as danger control. So think of the coronavirus. It causes fear. What can we do? We can wear a mask, wash our hands, keep our distance. We do that. Climate, not so much. What am I supposed to do about the polar bears and rising seas? So fear plus efficacy equals action. Fear with no efficacy equals resignation. Now, what about conflict? And Shane talked about this too, and I'm just building on that. Again, the conventional wisdom is that we have to avoid conflict at all cost. Conflict is bad. But is that really true? Well, we can think about conflict in a few different ways. Let's consider those news reports that present politics as a battle between sides, as a joust, or as hopelessly broken and hopelessly corrupt. Those kinds of tactical conflict frames shut people down and lead to a sense that nothing we do can make a difference. And it turns us off from the news. But what about the kind of conflict that mobilizes people, that feels generative and productive? So think about the courageous civil rights struggles of the 60s, or the fight that those brave activists led for access to AIDS medication in the 80s. Those struggles were motivated by conflict, but also by a sense of collective purpose to protect the rights that people held dear, or in the case of communities bearing the brunt of environmental degradation, to protect the places that people call home. That kind of conflict, as Shane said, can actually be extremely mobilizing and even healthy. So the coronavirus crisis lights up all of the elements in our head required for immediate action to mitigate risk. There's no gap between people's values and their actions. There's very few barriers. Most politicians sprang into action. The community came together. The news media covers it. But climate is very different. Climate is intangible. It can feel paralyzing. It requires massive system change. It demands addressing different audiences differently, in part because it's so polarizing. And we can talk more about addressing specific audiences for climate in the Q&A, because there are very different audiences for climate depending on who you are talking to. So there's all these challenges. But we can take some of the insights for why acting on COVID was so instinctive and so immediate and apply them to deconstructing the climate puzzle. So I presented three things here. First, to understand how and why there's a gap between what we know and what we feel, and how we act, which helps us understand the role of emotions and the need for speaking to people about climate through their values. Second, the various individual and social barriers to engagement on climate change, from lack of immediacy to lack of trust in government. And third, the role of fear and conflict. They are not always unproductive. And so with these tools, we can tell better stories and mobilize millions more people and ultimately craft better policies on climate over the next few years. So that's my talk. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your questions. And over to you, Joanna.
Just unmute. Thank you, Cam. I think you did a fabulous job of weaving in and building on Shane's opening remarks, and also giving us some kind of on the ground things to think about. I think this idea of rethinking and redefining fear and conflict in this moment are probably really, really helpful for climate communications. But
Hi.
hi, great.
Hi.
Everyone's back from their groups. You had a wonderful time, I hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, Oliver, I'm passing the baton to you now.
Sure. Welcome back, everyone.
Great.
I'm going to give you only about 1 minute to do a stretch if you want, or just walk around your desk or your table, so that we can dive into some of the questions. I'm very quickly going through your notes. Thanks so much for adding your notes to the Google Doc. Please feel free as well to add any comments to the chat right now, and we have a team of people trying to capture those. We're recording also comments and questions on the chat. So yeah, so take another few seconds for a stretch if you need that.
Hey, Roberto.
I think I'm going to mute everybody. If you'd like to chat, you can unmute yourself, or you can press the space bar to unmute yourself more easily. But just remember, if you've got your mouse in the chat area and you press the space bar, it doesn't work. So if you're trying to talk and you can't, that's maybe why. So with the intention of having no ambient noise, I'm going to mute everyone.
Okay, so I'm seeing a couple of comments here related to, so how do we go beyond getting people informed and act now and shake us out of this status quo? So the speakers, Cam and Shane, you mentioned thing about using fear to a certain extent and connecting that to action. So how do you find that balance? If you would like to comment on that, how much fear basically can you bring in, and what are the actions that we're wanting to ask people to take? Because there's a big focus, I find, at least through my experience working in the field, is people feel more comfortable talking about individual actions, what they can do at home and with their family. But how do we go past that into collective action? How do we talk to people about the importance and the impact of collective action, using that balance between fear and efficacy?
Cam, if I can just throw in a quick comment on that. So it's a great question. Thank you. And I get, like I said at the end, I tried to excuse myself by saying I don't have any easy, quick answers to any of this. But one comment I would make about this is I think that obviously, as I talked about in my presentation, I think the state matters a lot more right now than it has in the past. And there's a lot more opportunities. And I think that means political engagement, like I guess big political engagement in terms of engaging with parties and engaging with local electoral officials and governments and so on. I actually think that's really important at this particular moment. That can be getting involved through like constituency associations. It can involve talking to your elected representatives and so on. And I mean, I know that's a kind of a conventional response, but it feels to me like it matters more now than that there's more at stake in terms of that. So personally, I think that's, like, if I was looking to direct people into something, that's one of the places. I mean, obviously, being active in social media, being active in terms of writing letters to the editor and that kind of stuff is also important. When we talk about the Overton window, the way in which the Overton window was originally conceptualized, it's this idea that by affecting the public opinion on things, you shift the possibilities for making policy. And so I think any places in which we can reinforce these kinds of stories about the need for transformation and the public support for transformation are really, really valuable. And participating and being active on social media in terms of doing it, that's absolutely one of those ways. And then the last thing, I guess, I've felt for a while, and I think the first person who, or one of the people who really made me think this was Greta Thunberg, who broke so many rules of climate communication, which was don't talk about fear, don't, you know, and she's like, look, our house is on freaking fire. I want you to panic. Stop talking about this hope stuff all the time. Let's actually engage with this as a crisis. And I think that the pandemic sort of reinforces elements of that. Cam's absolutely right to talk about how there are elements of the fear we feel about the pandemic, which are more tangible, more so than climate. But in some ways, a lot of the pandemic fear is through media, right? It's through the kind of news that we're getting. And part of the reason why that fear has worked is because it's been everywhere. And we have never tried that with climate. We just, I mean, if you look at the sheer volume of stories about the pandemic and worry about the pandemic, it's off the charts. We've never had anything like that with climate. So we can't really even say that fear has worked in a climate context. So just rethinking the role that fear can play in motivating attention in that context, I think this is a good moment to at least reflect upon that. Sorry, that was a lot. I'll step back. Cam, go.
No, just briefly, I want to just build on that and to echo the point I made earlier that that again, in the conventional discourse around climate and a lot of the communication that we see from various communications ENGOs, this idea that fear and conflict are always necessarily bad, and that I just, you know, I went through the research and that it just doesn't bear out. And so I think that fear, again, when coupled with efficacy, is tremendously effective. That yes, you know, we're in a crisis, but there's actually things you can do about it. And to that point, and you know, I work in news, so obviously knowing our audience is very important. It's really crucial to, and I alluded to this in my talk. It's really crucial to know your audience. And Shane's written about this, and there's a lot of research on this as well. You know, there are different audiences for climate change. So if, for example, if you're a leader in the city of Vancouver, you might have a constituency here that is already very well read on the climate science and already very concerned and alarmed. So how do you motivate those folks to take action? That's going to be very different than motivating a group of residents living in a conservative part of the United States. So understanding the various tactics and strategies for motivating and mobilizing different climate audiences is key. And finally, again, speaking to people through their values. So if I'm a policymaker in Vancouver, probably the more effective way to engage audiences on climate is to talk about things like clean air and clean parks and bike lanes and reducing traffic congestion and reducing noise. These are the kinds of things that will find traction when you're door knocking. And I come back to you know, messages that reflect on people's love of the place they call home. And as Shane said, I do a lot of work on solutions journalism, and some of the best examples of solutions journalism are actually in red states in the United States, in very conservative parts of the country. And one of the most successful kind of stories is this idea of regenerative agriculture. And you know, farmers in very, very conservative parts of the United States care very much about the soil, care very much about the land. And that's a message that is an entry point for engaging on climate, if we think about it. So this is why I say understanding the audience is really, really crucial.
Okay, thank you. So there is a link to what you just said, Cam. There was a question about are the health benefits from addressing COVID and climate action a place where we can draw these parallels when we start conversations with people? The benefits to our health shown as we tackle COVID can be seen as well if we tackle climate change.
I'm trying to come up with a thoughtful response on that. I think that it's hard to come up with a kind of like a broad response, other than to say that messages that pertain to people's health tend to resonate quite well. I mean, health is a value that we all can connect with. So with respect to health, that value action gap is quite narrow. Mm-hmm. We see COVID as a direct and immediate threat to our health, and therefore we take immediate action on it. So it would follow that if we see climate as a health risk, as a public health risk as a personal health risk in terms of particles of pollution in the air or other forms of pollution that might impact our health, it follows that we would take action on that. But that's a very general statement. I think that, yes, generally that is a message that, you know, framing climate in the context of health is a message that is salient. But again, I think you have to look and distill that audience further. So for example, if you're talking to a highly polarized, conservative, Republican audience, maybe the message that is more salient than health even is national security, you know, the link between climate change and national security. So yes, to answer the question, generally speaking, I would say health is a message that resonates for all of us. But again, I would say looking at the motivations that matter to the audience for conservatives, for Republicans, highly polarized individuals, and Jonathan Haidt has written about this in terms of the 6 moral foundations, you know, things like freedom, individualism, nostalgia, you know, return to a glorious past. These are the values that really matter. And so I say yes to the person's question, but a qualified yes.
If I can just throw in quickly on that, yeah, there's certainly been work that I'm more familiar with in a U.S. context that talked about how a public health frame can actually be really quite helpful and less polarizing than a lot of other frames. And if you want to explore more on this, you might find the work that has come out of the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication. Ed Maibach in particular has done a fair bit of work on that, so you might follow up there. But often there's some evidence which suggests that public health frame, and obviously our health is top of mind now. People are thinking about it and they're understanding how fragile it is and how the things that determine our health are much broader than just our immediate environment, but the kinds of societies we live in. Making those kinds of connections now when they're top of mind to people, that might be a really, really effective and smart strategy at this particular moment.
Okay. So we only have a few more minutes left, and I have at least 4 or 5 comments and questions here that seem interesting. One here from Maya: has there been any luck with framing climate change action around long-term job stability, energy jobs, basically?
So if I can throw in, I mean, this is something that the people in the climate movement have been, or a lot of people in the climate movement have been trying to do for a long, long time. I mean, clearly this is one of the things that anchored the idea of a Green New Deal. And it's, you know, it's had somewhat uneven success. I think one of the challenges with it is broadening what is a green job. I think that for a long time there's been a tendency to see a green job in relatively narrow terms. Like these are people who build wind turbines and put solar panels on the top of houses. And I think one of the challenges, which certainly some unions and progressive groups have been trying to do, is broaden that much more significantly. And I think in the context of this, a perfect thing to be doing is caregiving and green jobs. There's a big overlap between those two things. And those two things are both essential for the well-being of all of us in our society. And so drawing out those connections and bringing that Venn diagram, if you will, making that clear and bringing those two parts together, I think that's a really, really productive, useful intervention when people are, you know, as I say, open to thinking, well, what actually is essential for our society? And so broadening what is a green job, and obviously in that context, responding to the massive unemployment, it's only going to be top of mind for people. So I think it's a really positive idea going forward, and there's maybe opportunities for advancing that now that there haven't been in the past.
Let me just answer that question in a sort of a different way, come at it from a slightly different angle. One of the things we didn't really talk about, although both Shane and I hinted at it, is the political economy behind climate action or inaction. We live in a country, as Shane mentioned, where you have very entrenched, powerful fossil fuel interests that shape the narrative around what constitutes economic growth and what is normal when it comes to economic growth. And those narratives get echoed and repeated, and I would even say validated in a lot of the news media discourse. And so there, there is a status quo bias is the way I would describe it, and I've heard it described as well. And shifting and dislodging our mental frame, and what I mean by our is Canadians' collective mental frame as to what constitutes a good economy is a very difficult task, particularly in the face of this status quo bias that is repeated constantly in the news media. And so I would say that from my perspective as a journalist, the link between COVID and long-term job stability is, I hope, and I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic, that coronavirus has shaken those foundations a little bit, or at least given people an opportunity to think and say, maybe there's a better way forward. Maybe, we can think about doing things differently. There are countless stories out there that aren't being told about a transition to a different kind of economy, a radical reshift. And telling those stories is quite difficult in the face of those normative social values that frankly need to be shaken up. And I'm cautiously optimistic that COVID will abet that, facilitate that a little bit. But again, dislodging those status quos and asking people to confront their assumptions is very, very difficult thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And maybe in connection with that as well, in terms of the economy, one question came up here, which is exactly the point that Shane had made in our group discussion, which is how are we going to pay for all these green policies and creating all these green jobs, and how this thought or this question paralyzes conversations. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so like I was saying in our group, and this was one of the things I would probably close with is I'm really worried about the fragility of the public fiscal capacity narrative right now, which is definitely out there. This possibility to rethink how governments actually finance things. It's not the same as a house and as a household. And I think that that's one of the challenges is to broaden people's understanding about how governments borrow money, what it means to be living in a very low interest rate environment where there is very little risk of inflation, and that creates massive capacity on the part of government to borrow money to borrow lots of money to facilitate this kind of transition in just the same way that happened around the Second World War, right? That people did not ask at the time, yeah, but how are we going to pay for it? We found the way because governments can do that under those conditions. So I want to sustain that, but I am worried about it. I am a little worried about how are you going to pay for it argument is going to erode that opportunity we have. So I don't have any easy answers for that other than, like, for example, there was a great interview on CBC Radio on the weekend with Jim Stanford, the former auto worker economist, who talked a lot about this. Getting people like that and their explanations, simple, compelling, accessible explanations about how government works and how financing works differently than we tend to think, getting those narratives out there is, I think, more important than ever right now. And there is a kind of openness to hearing that. But that is one of the most important things I think we need to shore up, because I'm worried that it's fragile.
I missed a bit of the question, Oliver, but I think it also touched on how do we break away from the paralysis that surrounds talking about climate. I would just say, first of all, I echo Shane's point that there is a general lack of understanding about how government finance works. And I've heard that concern that, oh, well, how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to pay for this? Echoed a lot. But as Jim Stanford said, and as Shane said, it doesn't quite work that way. And we have the money, and the economy will grow again. And some of the most productive years economically of the 20th century were immediately after the chaos and the carnage of the Second World War. So that idea that there's somehow a straight line between spending now to keep the economy alive and long-term deficits is generally misunderstood. On the notion of climate conversations, this is something that is discussed a lot in the climate movement that we're a part of, but the importance of having just conversations. As I said in my talk, climate change is a subject that gets shut down very fast. You want to shut down a conversation? Talk about climate change. So I think it's really incumbent on us as journalists, as policymakers, as leaders in this movement, to lower the bar on how we talk about climate. And I like to describe it as making climate change an elevator conversation. Just like weather is a conversation that comes up in the elevator, climate change can be an elevator conversation. And so there's really interesting research out there that shows that people who ride their bikes or change their light bulbs, they're not the ones who feel the most agency when it comes to climate. It's the ones who talk about it, teachers who talk about it in the classroom. That is what really shores up that sense of efficacy and engagement with this issue. So I just think simple conversations in your circle is a really important entry point for lowering the threshold of engagement on this subject. And that's, I think, something that we all instinctively know, but have to do more of.
Thank you, Cam. Thank you, Shane, as well. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us today. I'm going to stay with that idea of having more conversations and really not being afraid of trying different things and trying different narratives and understanding who your audience is. I know a lot of us work on the ground with different audiences. So whether you're working with kids or families or businesses, understanding what values resonate with them, with those audiences, and framing the conversations around that. So we only have a minute or so to wrap up. I want to thank you, the speakers, but all of you as well who've participated in the call. Thanks for joining. I also want to thank our sponsors and supporters of the event, Participedia.net, SFU's Faculty of the Environment, SPEC, our media sponsor, Canada's National Observer, and the North Family Foundation, and also the Vancouver design nerds, Julian and, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, that's froze, sorry. Yeah, so thank you to everybody on the team as well who has participated in this. We're gonna stay on, it's 11 o'clock now, so as you check out, please go ahead and share a word or a phrase, something that you're taking from this session in the chat. And we're gonna keep the session open for another 20 minutes. If you wanna stay and we have a conversation, last week that was very nice actually. We had about 20 people staying over and we had a good chat and shared some resources in the chat and also with live audio. And I don't think I'm missing anything. Of course, the next session is next week, next Wednesday at the same time, 9:30. The session is activating compassion and the creative spirit at the time of crisis. So please join us for that as well. And as I said, thank you very much everybody for being with us today, and stay with us for the next 20 minutes if you'd like to connect a bit more.